What are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about a very controversial subject. To wash or not to wash. I was brought up, my grandmother was a seamstress. My mother had 3 daughters, and she used to sew a lot of our clothes. I was brought up to bring the fabric home from the fabric store and wash it. And that continued right through as I took up quilting. And I'm in the minority now. I would say, based on the people that I talk to around the store, based on the quilts that I take in, I would say 75 to 80% of quilters do not pre-wash their fabric before they make their quilts. So I went, let's investigate this a little bit. So I started making a list of reasons why I like to pre-wash my fabric. And if you look it up online, you get 4 reasons. But I came up with 8. So I'm just going to kind of walk through them and see what you think. First of all, I actually did a little test. I'm going to hold this up. This is a piece of Kona. You probably won't be able to see much through the camera. I'm just holding. This is as it comes off the bolt, so completely unwashed. Just cut relatively straight with the rotary cutter. Okay, and then I had 3 same size pieces that I ran through the wash. So this one is washed, nothing else done to it. Okay, got a little fuzzy edges here, obviously pretty crinkly. This one was washed, and you can see my little label at the top. That was pressed, just ironed the way you would iron anything that comes out of the wash. Okay, and then this one was washed, pressed, and then best pressed. So good old Mary Ellen's best press. And if I took the label off of this piece of fabric, you would be able to tell it from the one that has not gone through the wash, except for the fuzzy edges. So why do I like to pre-wash my fabric? And I have my list. I have number 1 on the list, and we all know about this. I'm calling it dye transfer as opposed to running. I'm finding most new quilting fabrics really don't run. You throw them in the sink, you swish them around, and not a problem. On occasion though, and it's always the one that you don't want to run, you're going to get some dye bleeding out of that fabric. And strangely enough, not only just bleeding out in water. I've had fabric where it literally comes off on your hands. I quilted a quilt the other day that I think the fabric was pre-washed, but I wasn't sure. By the time I finished quilting that quilt, the backing fabric was green. It had literally turned the bed of my machine green. So that's what I'm meaning by dye transfer. I want to make sure that whatever fabric I'm working with, it's not going to interfere or rub off on what other fabrics I'm working with. Dye transfer, one reason why I like to pre-wash my fabric. Second reason, and I was online earlier today looking this one up, chemicals. We know that there are chemicals used in the manufacture of fabric. There's chemicals that make it smooth. There are chemicals put on it to make the dye stick to it. Maybe that's why fabrics don't run as much as they used to, because there are chemicals applied to the fabric that make the dye stick more strongly to the fibers so it doesn't wash out in. So not all chemicals are bad, but we have to ask ourselves, do we want them in our quilts? So those two are pretty straightforward. Number 3, Shrinkage. We all know about shrinkage. Average shrinkage on your basic quilting cotton, maybe 1%, maybe 1.5%. It does vary with the fabric, varies with the manufacturer. I cut all of my little samples here the same size. And just, even if I trimmed off the fuzzy edges, I might have lost 1/8 of an inch over 12 inches. That's not a whole lot for shrinkage on that. If that was flannel, however, flannel's going to have a shrinkage rate anywhere from 3 to 5%. So it's probably a good idea to pre-wash any flannel that you're using, especially if your quilt top is cotton and your backing is flannel. They're not going to shrink at the same rate when you go to wash the quilt. So shrinkage is definitely something that you kind of want to watch out for. Plain old dirt. Number 5, another reason why I like to pre-wash my fabric. Plain old dirt. Your average fabric store receives its shipment of fabric. Now, that fabric might have been made and printed a year ago. And then it's packaged and it goes to a warehouse, and then it goes from there, people place orders, it gets shipped on cargo ships in those big shipping containers, offloaded, sent, repackaged, wholesalers, finally winds up in your quilt shop. Right now it might be 8 months to a year old. Okay, that's not bad. Quite often they're wrapped. They're very well plastic wrapped. When Pat gets them in receiving, takes that plastic off, goes up on the shelf. And how long does it sit on the shelf of your local fabric store? We've got fabric out there, it comes in and it goes out as fast as we get it. Not really a chance to get much dirt on it, dust and so on. Some fabric tends to hang around. It's waiting for just the right customer to buy it. So it might get a little dirty. It might get a little fingerprints on it and that sort of thing. So plain old dirt. So that's 5. 5 reasons so far. Number 6 is kind of an odd one, but it does happen, and it happens, I guess, for me in the long arm. I see it more than some people. You don't know how many times I've loaded a backing, loaded the batting, put the quilt on, and I'm quilting the quilt and we're rolling it up, and there's one of our barcoded stickers quilted into the quilt because it was still stuck to the backing fabric. Now, it's not necessary to wash your fabric to get those stickers off, but it does help. Sometimes they've actually gone through the wash. People do wash their fabric and they've forgotten to peel that sticker off. But it put me in mind of, if you take a piece of fabric and you go to use it without checking it over, there could be hidden flaws in that fabric. There could be creases that are basically factory made in that piece of fabric. There could be things stuck on it. There could be something on the fabric that you didn't see in the fabric store. But if you take the time to wash, or at least pop that fabric in the dryer and then press it. A wonderful lady used to own Addie's up in Cochrane. She used to call it bonding with her fabric. And when she had a quiet time at home, she would literally get out her pieces of fabric and spend a couple of hours just ironing them, just pressing them, and she called it bonding with her fabric. And I find the same thing. Sometimes it's just nice to take that fabric out of the dryer. It looks ratty, it's all wrinkled and everything. And then you press it and you make it nice and smooth again. You can see the design. It also helps to keep things up here. If you've got a vast quantity of fabric, it keeps it up here, and you'll go at the quilt store and you're shopping for something and go, wait a minute, I've got that piece of fabric. You remember it more. You have actually bonded with your fabric. This is also related to something that I call torque. If you've ever bought a pair of blue jeans and you throw them in the washer and the dryer and you pull them out, you hold them up and you got one leg that goes like this, it's because fabric, when it's woven, when it's prepared and then it's folded and it's rolled onto the bolts, it can have literally twist or torque in the fibers. We notice it when we're loading backings in the long arm area. But that piece of fabric, and let's see if I can find my original one. Not that one, this guy. You can see it in the fabric if you look closely at the grain. And unfortunately, sometimes what can happen with that is you're trying to cut nice and straight on the grain, but the grain itself is not straight. By washing your fabric, running it through the dryer, and then pressing it, it's like all of those fibers relax. And I like my fabric when I'm quilting to be relaxed, not under any artificial stress or tension. I find I just get better results. When I cut a square out of a piece of relaxed fabric, I know that even if I wash it or manipulate it, it's not going to change much. So I like my fabrics to feel natural, normal, relaxed, the way they're going to feel, as opposed to having the sizing in. If I want sizing in my fabric, I can use Mary Ellen's. Great stuff, great stuff. So I can get my fabric to be as flat, as smooth as if it just came off the bolt with a spritz or two of Best Press on it. I love using this stuff. Okay, so stickers, plain old dirt, torque. Now, I don't know if it applies to all types of fusible web, but I do find that I like to use heat and bond. It's what I've always used for applique, and I've done a ton of applique. Heat and bond does not stick well to a lot of fabrics if they haven't been washed. It seems to resist, the sizing in the fabric seems to resist the heat and bond. So there's nothing more frustrating than you get all those little pieces traced out on your paper, and then you go to fuse it onto just the right piece of fabric and it won't stick. It just won't stick. Now you got to retrace it because you've destroyed the glue on your fusible web. Or it'll stick maybe to the one fabric, but it won't stick to what you want to glue it onto. So I always found that was really frustrating. Pre-washing your fabric, you don't have to worry about that. I like fabric that feels soft and flexible. I like to feel the real texture of the fabric, because to me, every bolt of fabric out there practically, certainly every fabric line, has a little bit of a different feel. I was buying fabric on Saturday. Yes, I know it was a day off, but and it was for a backing for a quilt that I'm going to hand quilt. So I knew I wanted a fabric that was going to be soft and flexible and easy to put the knit through, or the needle through. So I went specifically to a line of fabric that I'd used before that feels nice and crisp on the bolt. But I knew that once it was washed, it was going to be soft like a voile or a batiste that we used to use in clothing. And I knew it would needle properly. So using these, using your fingers, I mean, we shop with our eyes in a quilt shop, but use your fingers to feel the fabrics. Get them to talk to you through your fingers. So pick them up. Don't be afraid. We won't yell at you. Take a corner of them and go like this and feel that fabric. So that was my list of 8. Is there any reason to not wash your fabric? Mostly the reasons that people give me when I talk to them is twofold. They like the way the fabric is nice and crisp when they're using their rotary cutter. They feel they get good, clean edges. That's a legitimate thing. I prefer to use best press because then I know what's on the fabric, but yeah, it's definitely true. You do get a nice clean cut when you're working with unwashed fabric. And the other thing that I hear most often is people who want to create the quilt top. They layer it, they quilt it, and then they wash the whole quilt because they like that old-fashioned, bubbly, wrinkly look you get with washing fabric that's already been quilted. And that's a legitimate reason to do it as well. Just bear in mind that you have to watch out for point number 1, the dye transfer, and that a lot of fabrics do not shrink at the same rate, even if they're quilting cottons, a variety of quilting cottons. They will shrink at different rates. And then, as Linda Daniluk was saying when I was talking to her about, I want to tell people why I wash my fabric. She says, okay, go for it. Third thing that I think a lot of people worry about too much is they just want to get quilting. It doesn't take a lot of effort. Like, as Linda said, if she was making a wall hanging and she knew it was never going to get washed, then she wouldn't worry about pre-washing her fabric. And that's true as well. You're working on a little wall hanging like this, never going to get washed. Yeah, go for it. This is not a you must. This is what works for me. So, yeah, it's not wrong. It's one of those things like we're in this camp or we're in that camp. But now you know why I'm in the camp I'm in. So most of my stuff has, and yes, I've actually washed quilts that have gotten stuff on them. That's the other thing too. If you're making a really big quilt, remember that's going to be much harder to wash once it's actually turned into a quilt. It's going to be heavy. You might have to hit up the laundromat for that one. So that's about all I got for today. Thanks for joining us today. Another Technique Tuesday. Everybody have a wonderful rest of the week. What does Anne say? Stay calm, stay safe, and stay kind, everybody. Thanks again. Bye for now.